Hello, and today I will be talking about my lookbook assignment. Specifically, I will be taking a historical look at the Swedish culture through dress. Now, I will be talking about Swedish dress in the 18th century first. For Swedish dress in the 18th century, um, women's fashion featured mantras. However, eventually, petticoats and sometimes aprons were worn. The robe à la Française was also worn during this period. They usually had a low cut, square necklines and were also trimmed with lots of laces or ribbons. The sleeves were bell shaped, and the sleeves are also were more became a little bit more narrow later on in this period. The young women would wear lighter colors, solid colored, or floral silks with ornamentations. Their shoes had curved high heels along with pointed toes, even adding some sort of decorations. The makeup they would use would be heavy white foundation that was made up of a number of different substances, like white lead, for example. In 18th century Sweden, men wore the habit à la Française that consisted of three parts, which are just a corpse, jacket, and breeches. The waistcoat had lots of decoration and was usually had some sort of patterned fabric. Coats were worn close to the body and were open to display the waistcoats. Skirts of the coat were wider and had been stiffed with buckram, horsehair, etc. The fabric that was worn by men were silks, velvets, and brocades, with wool being used by the middle class. The shoes men wore had square toes. The heels on the shoes were smaller, and the shoes also came with a buckle. The men would wear wigs in multitude styles, and they all depended on the occasions and the age of the person wearing it. In this time period, people would wear wigs, corsets, and heeled shoes, along with lots of ornamentation and decorations added to clothing. Different body modifications that were used during this time period in Sweden was a corset, which women wore, which counts as a body modification, and another one would also be the wigs that were commonly worn, which would come in brown, blonde, tape, grayish, and woolly colors that were then powdered white. They were made with horse or goat hair. Sweden. As for the other period I will be talking about, will be Swedish dress in the 1920s and 1930s. In this era, women had adopted looser fitting clothing. Around the 20s, fashion for women changed due to the women's societal roles changing. Things like blouses and skirts were worn. Also, headbands were worn coming in different styles like head wraps and brain binders, for example. On top of that, clothes were designed for women with more flatter chests or also more boyish figures. On the other hand, men in this period wore things like suit jackets. Along with this, things like Oxford bags became popular. Hats were worn, but were in upper class. But people in upper, but it usually was dependent on class. People that were in upper class wore top hats or Homburg hats, while the middle class wore fedoras, bowler hats, and trophy hats. And lastly, lower class had newsboy caps and flat caps. Men also had access to sweaters and trousers, which were considered sports clothes. The trends in fashion. During this time, flappers were worn in part due to the effects of the First World War, which saw fashion becoming less extravagant and more simple, with more accessible fabric being used for clothing. Along with the flapper, there was also the robe de style that also became popular. For body modifications, symbolic dress, uh, the ones that were prevalent in this era were things such as makeup as well as corsets for women. However, corsets were not as oppressive like in the 19th century and were becoming more relaxed. Now, for Swedish dress in the 18th century, lower SES, Swedish women lower class during the 18th century wore shifts, pocket stays, petticoats, a gown, kerchief, an apron, lock stockings with garters and caps. The ideal body shape for this period was conical. The lower SES usually wore clothes made of wool, linen, or cotton. Along with the women, the Swedish men's clothing were also made of wool, linen, or cotton if they were of the lower SES. They would wear shirts, breeches, waistcoats, frock coats, long stockings along with garters and caps. On top of all this, men would also wear shoes that would be made of leather. This social class would wear wigs until that became unfashionable later on in this era. Trends in fashion. Swedish women during this time gravitated towards light pastel colors due to the time and also economic status. For the lower class, clothes were maintained and looked after very well, eventually being passed down. Only wealthier people could afford to have lots of clothes. Linen was the most popular fabric due to its versatility. Due to the lower class having less access to clothing, people's best clothes were used for special festivities, festifications, or for things like weddings. Around this time, for the Swedish dress in the 18th century middle SES, around this time was the rise of the middle class. At first, around this time, men wore bright colors with embroideries. However, eventually those were dropped for darker clothes with little decoration. Men in the middle class wore linen or cotton shirts, sleeveless waistcoats, and just a corpse with knee breeches. Women's clothing for the middle class people also was very similar to the upper class. However, there were key differences like material. However, due to sumptuary laws, court dresses were more extravagant, while everything outside of that was toned down. However, eventually all sumptuary laws were abolished. A trend for the middle, for trends in fashion, a trend for the middle SES was for women the Rococo influence that had colorful floral patterned silk with petticoats with trimming that also had serpentine bands. Now, that is the end of my presentation. Thank you.